This video is going to review the midterm that you just took. This was the general breakdown of how you could have scored and what I was looking for on the exam. But I'll explain all of that scoring in deep detail when we meet in class. This video's focus is really just on the substance and the arguments and what I was looking for in terms of the law. I give 5 points for whether you used IRAC, whether it was easy to read, your arguments and counter arguments, were you using headings, subheadings, paragraphs, white space, was it complete? Did you have errors? Were you using see above and supra? Almost everyone got 5 points on this section. However, there were a few people that gave me giant paragraphs or didn't split up the elements, which made it hard to read. And so if you did that, I usually deducted 0.5 for every time you did that. As for substance, we had the ex parte TRO. So first issue, can the TRO hearing be held ex parte? There were a few people who actually discussed whether the TRO itself would be appropriate. And so that's really important that you read the prompts. If you miss this highlighted part, which it says, do not discuss whether the TRL itself would be appropriate, you would have lost a lot of valuable time discussing the elements, where I really only needed you to discuss that ex parte rule we went over. And here you should have split up the sections. So deal with A first, which is the immediate irreparable injury before the adverse party can be heard. So mostly everyone did a decent job talking about what the immediate irreparable injury would be, but there was a little bit missing in terms of the analysis as to whether that injury would occur before the hearing could be held, where D can argue his rights. After P told D to be nicer to the tenants, D was so upset that he damaged the side of the building and began throwing garbage at the tenants. Well, this kind of signals he might have a bad attitude or he has an outburst. And so if they tell him or give notice of this TRO, he might actually go crazy and cause more damage. And this is only when P told him to be nicer. Imagine if he knew he was going to be evicted from this area. The other argument you could make is P struggling to rent out the offices because of the reputation of the homeless trespassing problem, which means the injury is ongoing, actually immediate and happening right now, and you can't fix your reputation. But the flip side is, well, it's been ongoing for 10 years. What's another couple of months or a couple of weeks? It's not going to make a difference. And that's where you would have talked about, well, D's living on the property for 10 years and only had one outburst. It's been ongoing. There's no real concrete evidence that giving him notice would be worth depriving him of his constitutional right to be heard. He's also homeless, which means he can probably appear really quickly if the court makes that a priority. Right, so there's a lot of stuff you could have argued. Did I expect you to argue every single thing? No, probably just argue a couple things or have arguments for and against. Now, notice was the really straightforward, simple analysis here. So you could see that this element was the complicated one, but notice was supposed to be straightforward because there weren't really any facts. But if you decided to be a little bit more interpretive of the facts, you could talk about, well, you know where he is because he lives on P's property, so it's easy to locate him. But he's homeless. Maybe he might not be there during the daytime. Or maybe, like we just talked about, it's not appropriate to give notice because it's going to make him angry and then he's going to cause harm to everybody. And again, you don't need to do all these arguments. These are just all the possible arguments that I would have given points for. I'm trying to account for all the different points of view on how these facts could be interpreted. The next big section, which was the most amount of points, was the equitable relief, permanent injunctive relief, and defenses section. We had a lot of people just not talk about any of the defenses or miss one of the defenses, which really hurt their score. But I'm pretty proud to report that everyone did a pretty good job on this permanent injunctive relief section. The rule, as we've gone over multiple times, has the 4 factors. For irreparable injury, you could have talked about how 5 of the tenants have moved out, that D has actually damaged the side of the building and threw garbage at tenants. You could have also mentioned P's reputation, and it's hard to fix your reputation, and it's certain because, well, all the tenants have already moved out and you can see the physical damage. A really weak kind of side counter argument, which was a bonus, is you could say, well, technically it's not irreparable because P allowed you to stay on the property, so it's kind of like P's own fault. But that doesn't really make the injury itself any less severe. The next issue, inadequate remedy of law, the sub rule is whether damages are uncertain. You had multiple lawsuits, someone's insolvent, it's unique goods or land, or no other way to protect the right. And so P had tons of arguments here. D is homeless, means he has no money. D is living on P's property. Land cannot be substituted for money. It's unique. And so you can see here an example in the rubric where I say, here's the fact I gave you. And now the underlying part is the inference that I expected you to make from that fact based on the sub rule that we just went over. So he's homeless. One of the sub rules says someone's insolvent. Well, I need you to connect. Well, it means he likely has no money to pay P. Other things that I saw people talk about are harm to reputation. It's difficult to quantify. And also D's presence is discouraging tenants from renting the offices. So the only way to protect the right is to, ask him to leave. And here, this is a good example of, I really only expected you to have two arguments. So in some case, if you made all four, or you didn't make the argument about the homelessness, but you talked about harm to reputation, it would just cancel out in terms of points. The points you lost, you would just make up in bonus points. I did expect you also to see the counter that the damages are certain because the cost of repair, the diminution of value can be measured, but it definitely is weaker. So it should have just been a passing point that you mentioned. Now, I think the hardest, most complicated section for this was the balancing of the hardships, which is why I created a chart. And for D, you had, well, he lives on the property for 10 years. P allowed him to stay. Homelessness is a widespread problem. He has nowhere to go. Basically, the inference is being, well, if he has nowhere to go, it's hard for him to move. If it's a widespread problem, there's no space elsewhere. It's just unfair to have him move and have his life given up when we're dealing with just a property right for P. P can say, well, he's homeless. He doesn't have any actual property rights. He's just sitting on my property. Or if he's homeless, one alleyway is the same as another alleyway. And if there's 7,000 people and this is a problem, then there's a lot of other people with the same hardship. It's kind of not my problem that's just dealing with my property. It's more of like a widespread issue that we have to deal with. One of the weaker arguments for D is he might say, well, no, P, your interest is still not, your hardship isn't that great because you still have 5 tenants that are leasing. I'm not really affecting you. But as we discussed in irreparable injury, that's likely going to be weaker because the harm to the building or reputation, unable to rent out offices in fear, all of this stuff is actually really hard for P to overcome if D is allowed to stay on the property. You could have really gone either way. Now, the last factor was the public's interest. Could have talked about how, well, if it's a widespread problem, protecting private property is good. So it knows people have something to enforce their rights. You could have said, well, on the flip side, D is homeless. And if there's that many homeless people, public's interest is to not evict him and figure out a better problem. Tenants are part of the public and we don't want D to harass the tenants the same way D is part of the public and we want to take care of the homeless. Like there was a lot of stuff you could have argued here. And I was pretty open as long as it made sense in terms of giving points. The other thing you could have talked about is the judicial supervision over a long period of time, especially when you're dealing with something so large as a homeless list issue. How would that impact everyone else suing on this if we decide that someone can evict a homeless person? Like, how does that work? Pretty much talking about how difficult is it to enforce when there's this widespread issue and we could have more lawsuits. Or is it technically easy to enforce because we're only dealing with D and P, and that's what we need to focus on, not the bigger issue. So you could have gone either way there. And so that was kind of what I was looking for, the permanent injunctive relief. For the equitable estoppel and latches, we didn't have a lot of people talk about it at all. And so the issue is, should the plaintiff be stopped from obtaining equitable relief? Some people talked about promissory estoppel, but again, this goes back to reading the prompt. I specifically said, do not discuss TRO's preliminary injunctive relief or promissory estoppel, because you wouldn't have finished if you tried to talk about promissory estoppel as well. And I knew that some people might interpret the representations that Patrick was making as a promise, even though there was no actual explicit promise made in this case that would trigger promissory estoppel. So if you read that, you would have only talked about equitable estoppel. And so you needed to talk about these 4 elements. And so equitable estoppel was supposed to be a rather simple analysis. So if you found yourself going through it quickly, it's because it wasn't as back and forth or ambiguous as permanent injunctive relief. So party to be estopped knew the facts. The party to be estopped here is P. The facts are whether P wanted D on the property or that D was a nuisance, right? That P actually didn't want D on the property. And you had all these facts from 2011 to 2020. There was a lot of mixed messages being sent here, but the consistent message was D, you can stay here. And so D's arguments is, well, I can't get into P's mind. How am I supposed to know that he didn't want me on the property and hated homeless people when all he's representing and telling me is you can stay? P's argument is, well, he didn't know he's eventually going to want D off the property or that D was going to harass people, right? When he said D could stay each time, he thought D would just behave properly And, he can't also predict the future. So maybe he didn't know the facts at the time he made the representation. The second part, intended conduct to be acted on or party had the right to believe. P's arguments were a bonus. I think it was weak, pretty explicit that he said you can stay. But D maybe in 2017 should have known that if he said you could stay but be nicer to tenants, that was like a conditional reason that he was allowed to stay. And by D not figuring that out, he had no right to believe he could stay on the property if he wasn't nicer to people. The more obvious argument is, well, D had no idea P secretly wanted to leave. It was actually stated in the facts. And that P explicitly said D could stay in the alleyway multiple times. A reasonable person would believe that it's okay for D to stay on the property. For C and D, the last two elements, it was really straightforward. P never asked D to vacate the premises. D had no idea P secretly wanted him to leave. And did D actually rely on P's representations that he could stay? Well, yeah, he's homeless and he's lived in the alleyway for almost 10 years because P's allowed him to live there. So this was met. So it really depends on element A, whether you decide P knew the facts at the time, whether he wanted D to stay on the property or not, or if everything that occurred over the 10 years, P was changing his mind. Now, the last big issue was latches. We had more people that spotted latches than equitable estoppel. And so you had to talk about the three kind of factors. For unreasonable delay, I was looking for you to first look at the delay overall, which is 2011 to 2020, which is 9 years, which is a long time. But because we had something happen in 2017 that kind of changed the situation, you could have split it up into delay 1 and delay number 2. Reasonableness here will be different because the facts that P knew at the time were different from 2011 to 2017 and from 2017 to 2020. For 2011 to 2017, you could have made arguments for both sides. P knew that D was in the alleyway and it's unreasonable to assume homeless people won't harass others. But P also didn't know that D was harassing tenants until 2017. So this more likely is a reasonable delay here if you didn't know there was an issue. Now for 2, this is where it gets a little bit fishier because he didn't visit the property or the alleyway for 3 years after telling D to not harass the tenants. A reasonable landowner would probably make sure everything is good once he's gotten a complaint. But P might say he might not know the extent of the interference until 2020, which is when the tenants didn't renew their leases, especially if no one told him the problem was still happening. And so here you could have gone either way. Now, prejudice to the defendants, people struggle a little bit more to talk about this than the unreasonableness of the delay. And you had a bunch of conversations that happened between 2011 and 2020, and tenants that are living there or moved out. D's argument, yeah, he has nowhere to go. That's fine. That's a prejudice. That's an injury to him. But at the same time, we want to really focus on the evidence, witnesses, and the memory of the parties. And so there were the 2 convos between D and P, which are several years apart. 5 tenants have moved out. Tenants might not have remembered what had happened. There's a lot of evidence that might be hard for D to collect to defend himself. But at the same time, P has arguments that in 2020, when he asked D to leave, D obviously remembered that he was told he could stay on the property. So he shows he still has his memory. And there are 5 tenants that have renewed the lease and can testify. And we can easily locate the old tenants if we need them to come back, as well as the physical damage is obvious. We can take pictures and visit the site. So maybe there really isn't any prejudice. You could have gone either way here. And then finally, injury to third parties or any other party. There was no facts that suggest P's delay has hurt anyone else. You could have gone into the nuance argument about the delay hurting the tenants, but that's kind of the opposite because the tenants would now want P to pursue the action, even though they were harmed by the delay of D's presence still being on the property. Now, sliding scale might have helped you because if P has a weak excuse for delay, then D can show less prejudice was caused. If P has a strong excuse for delay, then D must show more prejudice was caused. So for period 1, P didn't know that D was harassing the tenants. That's a pretty reasonable excuse. But for period 2, it could have gone either way, right? Someone's expected to monitor their property, but at the same time, P didn't know that D was still harassing the tenants until they didn't renew their leases. Whether you thought that was reasonable or not, and how it compared to the prejudice that D was experiencing would have impacted how you concluded on this issue. And then finally, we have framing. You need to state the rule, and then you need to do the W's. It has to be specific or have reasonable detail. And so who is D? What and where is you can't enter the building, be within this many feet of P's building, can't make contact with P or any tenants. There's a lot of stuff you could have talked about. And then when it should begin immediately and probably last until D is no longer homeless. But you could have just talked about, well, it should just begin now, or they need to determine how long it needs to last, would have been enough to get full